Hey everyone, this is Fran from the 5-Minute Modeler, and today we're going to be scratch building a portable grain auger using some parts from our scrap box, some wire and some glue. These grain augers are a great addition to your layout. If you have covered hopper cars and a team track or other siding or any type of farm scene with silos and the like, these tools were used to load grain into or out of silos and covered hoppers by moving the material up through a pipe, rising up to the bins for storage, and depositing it into the appropriate storage facility. I've been wanting to build one of these for some time and finally sat down to do it. Even though I have a couple of industries that take covered hoppers on my layout, I also have a few team tracks, and these would be great spots for these. I'm building mine in N scale, which is a bit of a challenge, but these same principles can be used in making these in HO scale as well as any other scale. Now, like anything in this hobby, you can buy something like this on the internet. While no major manufacturers that I know of are making these, there are a couple of folks on Pinterest and eBay that are selling 3D printed models. But what's the fun in that, right? There's nothing better than building one yourself. So in researching this project, I searched the internet for articles on building one, but only found a couple YouTube videos, and both were in HO scale. I'll put the links to those in the description so you can review them as well. For me, I had already started building one of these based on my own design before I saw these articles. They had some good tips on modeling those, and I probably used some of them in building mine. I also researched grain augers and learned that they can vary in size. Some of these pictures will give you an idea. Many of these are designed to be towed behind a vehicle, be it a pickup truck or a farm tractor. And even though I know nothing about how these are used in real life, I set out to make one that is representative and gives the flavor of the tool. Because my hands kept getting in the way of the camera while building this, I'm going to augment the video with some drawings of what I used to design mine and the various parts. You don't need to use these exactly like I did, but it should give you a sense of what are the pieces that you need to put yours together. There are several key parts that I'm going to focus on here. First, the primary pipe, which contains the auger. An auger is basically a long screw that turns and grabs the material and moves it up to the top of the pipe, where it is then dumped into the covered hopper or to a truck. It's powered by a small motor. There are additionally a set of supports and one set of wheels that support the structure, and to me, that gives it an iconic and unique look. There's also a small bin that collects the material at the bottom, which the auger pulls in and transports up the pipe. So, for this project, I used the following materials: a plastic sprue, about 5 inches in length, small gauge stiff wire. I used, in this case, my go-to wire, which is old guitar strings, but any stiff wire will work, brass, steel, what have you. I used some scraps of styrene, .010, and some CA glue, some styrene cement, and some paint. That's really it. The tools I used included an X-Acto knife, a sanding stick, or fine sandpaper, it works just as well, a scale ruler, wire cutters, razor saw, some needle nose pliers, and a soldering iron. If you make this out of styrene, though, you may be able to substitute the soldering iron for styrene cement. So the first thing I did was to find an appropriate sprue to use for the tube. Fortunately, most of the longer sprues that come with model kits are about the right size for this, about 1 scale foot in diameter. You could go smaller than this, but it does become a bit harder the smaller you go. So I made a couple of these using what I learned from the first one and the videos I watched later. If you're using a sprue and it has the post for the part, you'll need to trim those off and sand the sprue smooth. Although you may want to leave one on the end for the grain to come out of and into the bin. I made my first one about 30 scale feet long, which is probably the smallest I would do in N scale. Once the sprue was clean, sanded, and smooth, I moved on to the wire stand and axle for the wheels. This is probably the hardest part of the project, and it's not that hard. In researching these, most have a triangular shaped frame with the bottom of the triangle ending attaching to the axle. If you notice in the pictures, most of these are obtuse angles. Not that I'm a geometry expert by any means, but basically bigger than a right angle. Now this angle will depend on the length of your auger, and in real life they are adjustable to allow for different sizes of trucks and rail cars to load, and that changes that angle. On my first auger, I drew out a template from a scale drawing I made, and I placed it on a piece of wood and marked the angles of the triangle. One side is longer than the other, so I accounted for that. I took a piece of wire, measured out a little bit more than what I thought I needed, and then using the needle nose pliers, I bent the wire to about a 30-degree angle with a short flat spot on the top. For the second piece, I also bent the wire to a 30-degree angle, but made this one a bit longer. I cut a piece of wire that would be the axle for the wheels, cutting that a bit longer than needed to start with. I then soldered the axle to the smaller of the two triangles. Many of the augers I observed had a brace on the longer triangle side, so I soldered a piece of wire to that. Again, if you're using styrene for this, you could just glue it. I purposely didn't solder the two pieces together at this point for two reasons. One, I didn't know the angle I would need as I was really building this kind of on the fly. Secondly, I was concerned that if I soldered it, I'd likely unsolder the other pieces that I already had soldered. In retrospect, one might take one single piece of wire and make the entire structure out of that. To make the wheels, I used the sprue material from a bit larger diameter sprue and cut a very thin slice with my razor saw. You could also use a hobby knife. If you have an old vehicle from your layout, you could use the wheels from that. I didn't have one, so I made my own. I did look at using the wheels from some old Matchbox cars, but they're much too big. I did use a small drill to drill holes in the center of the wheels, but you can also use the end of a number 11 blade on your hobby knife. It doesn't need to be too deep, and later we'll use CA glue to adhere the wheel to the axle. So back to the pipe. I noticed that in many cases, the pipes were actually sections of pipe bolted together to form a longer pipe. You can produce this with just a bit of paper trimmed to a very small width, wetting the pipe with a bit of glue, and wrapping the paper around the pipe. The glue will absorb into the paper, and once painted, will become permanent. If you don't want to take that step, it's in N scale that won't be noticeable. But I thought it added a nice little touch. On the top, I glued very small strips of styrene that would be used to support a wire that runs the length of the pipe. Once those pieces dried, I used CA to attach a thin wire to these pieces. To build the small bin, I used 0.010 styrene for this. If you have something thinner than that, I'd use that. But this worked pretty well. I cut a piece slightly wider than the pipe, then cut the sides, making angle cuts at the end of each piece. You can see the measurements I used on this diagram. I used styrene cement to secure these to the edge of the base, flaring them out slightly. When these had dried, I used it to measure a piece for the backside, and I tried to match the angle. Once I glued these together, there was some rough edges, and I used sandpaper to lightly sand those and knock off those edges. I then sanded a bit of the end of the tube and glued it to the bin, making sure everything was aligned. The most challenging part of the project was aligning and securing the wheel frame to the pipe. In the first model, I planned to adhere this to the underside of the pipe. This required cutting a slot into the plastic that was adhered to the pipe in 2 different spots in order to keep it from slipping while gluing. Before assembling it, I trimmed the ends of the wires as close as I could to their end points. I left a bit of space on the end of the axle for the wheels. I then used CA to secure the 2 triangles together, and then used CA again to secure them to the pipe. Once this was glued, I added the wheels with a bit of CA on the axle. I primed this with some white primer from a rattle can. Most of these that I've seen are painted red, yellow, or white. I chose yellow for mine and brush painted it using numerous light coats of a mixture of yellows. A little rust on the underside, and we can call it done. So my second one went pretty much the same as the first, and the second one is the one you see in the video. Overall, I think it was a pretty easy project. It probably took 2 hours maybe to build it out. Not that long once I knew what I was doing and having the drawings. So I hope that you find that this is something you can model with just the scraps in your scrap box, and it doesn't cost anything to speak of, and it's a great little model. I think it'll draw a lot of attention from viewers to my model railroad, and I'm excited to show it off. So thanks again for joining another 5-Minute Modeler, and we hope to see you on the next one. Thanks.